Welcome to the New Intellectual Book Study. I'm Cody Leibold. We're looking at John Galt's speech in Atlas Shrugged. We're reading it in this book for the New Intellectual. This is our third session out of 5, and we are on page 146. In our previous reading, we had seen John Galt explain that there was a moral code that split humanity into two groups, those who had need and those who had value. And to the extent that you had need, then you had a claim on other people. To the extent that you had value, then they had a claim on you. And so that is where we are in the reading. He says, are you surprised that it was so hard to achieve a sense of brotherhood, goodwill between you and other people on this kind of moral code, on this way of looking at the world? Now we get to the bottom of 146, the justification of sacrifice. What is this justification of this whole system? Well, he says that the justification for it is even more morally twisted than the idea itself. You should love every man. You should feel love for every man. He believes that this is an even greater perversity, to claim that you ought to love something regardless of whether it is a value to you. Now, why does he claim that? I'm a Christian, and as I read this, I think I've heard a lot of messages that suggest to me that I ought to love unconditionally. John Galt is rejecting this idea of unconditional love. He comes across as completely immoral on the framework that many Christians approach this with. But we go to top of 147 and we see why he frames the moral issues this way. He says, as there can be no causeless wealth, so there can be no causeless love, or any sort of causeless emotion. An emotion is a response to effective reality, an estimate dictated by your standards. To love is to value. Now, when he says to love is to value, he's not speaking in an extended sense. He means it very precisely. He means that love and value are the same thing. When you believe that something is of value to your life, that is what it means to love it. If somebody is going to come and tell you that you ought to value something that you have decided with your mind is not valuable, then he's telling you to invalidate your mind. As we have been discussing, the theme of Atlas Shrugged is the role of the mind in life. And here it is. Here's the core. The core of what he's trying to say here is a moral idea, not a political idea or a social idea, but it's a moral idea. What does it mean to value something? What does it mean to love something? The spirit of the age and the trend of history has gone toward teaching people that they must value the valueless. And Christianity has some influence on this pattern, and we'll see that. But let's go on. He writes, the man who tells you that it is possible to value without values, to love those whom you appraise as worthless, is the man who tells you that it is possible to grow rich by consuming without producing, and that paper money is as valuable as gold. So what he's telling you is that it's a counterfeit. We go to the middle of the page. Love is the expression of one's values. The greatest reward you can earn for the moral qualities you have achieved in your character and person, the emotional price paid by one man for the joy he receives from the virtues of another. Just as we had mentioned in previous discussions, there's a trade going on here, but it is a trade of appreciation for what we see in the other person. You could compare it to the way that when you love a work of art, it's not exactly the same thing as a material trade. Rather, it's a spiritual value that you perceive in the other person. You get a sense of joy from that other person. When you love a work of art, you have an appreciation for it. It elevates your spirit when you perceive it, and that's the same feeling that we get when we are with our friends, or when we're with our spouses, or even our children. The payment that we receive in this loving relationship is the payment of appreciation for who they are. Galt describes this as an emotional price paid by one man for the joy he receives from the virtues of another. So it's a special kind of trade, not a material trade. He goes on and he says, your morality demands that you divorce your love from values and hand it down to any vagrant, not as response to his worth, but as response to his need. Now, he considers this an affront to good morality, because it's so destructive to the very idea of what love is, or what valuing is. Now he goes on, he says, your morality tells you that the purpose of love is to set you free from the bonds of morality. Ouch. That love is superior to moral judgment, that true love transcends, forgives, and survives every manner of evil in its object, and the greater the love, the greater the depravity it permits to the loved. The worldview, the system of ideas that he's describing here, sounds a lot like the popular level understanding of Christianity, perhaps 50 years ago, 70 years ago, in the United States. I don't know the degree to which I would say that this is the popular level of understanding today, but it is somewhat prevalent within the general population, as well as within the church and mainstream evangelicalism, Catholic teaching. This worship of the zero, this idea that you ought to love something because it's not lovable. This can be seen in Mother Teresa as the exemplar of love. There are two different ways to look at what she was doing. If you believe that what she's doing is investing in eternal values because people matter to God and she loves them and she values them, and you treat the picture of Mother Teresa serving on the streets of Calcutta very poor people, very diseased people, as her loving them because they are valuable to her, I have no problem with it. But if you listen to her account of what she was doing, I'm not convinced that that actually was her motivation. I think that she might have been conceiving her actions as an example of self-abnegation. I'm not sure, but I do know that other people have looked at it and they've said that that's the story that they want to tell about what she was doing. That self-abnegation was the reason why it was valuable. Giving up her life for the sake of something that had no lasting value was the reason why it was morally good. I don't actually agree with that as a Christian. I don't think that what she did was of no lasting value, because caring for people is of lasting value. But you can see there are different ways that you could do a set of twists in how you understand something. And the set of twists makes it so that you look at the same exact facts and you evaluate them quite differently for different reasons. And the point that we're trying to discuss here is simply that, is it true that we ought to value something because it is valueless? Is that really the moral calculation going on here? That's clearly not what the Bible teaches us to do. It's never been what the Bible has taught. We've looked at that in depth. But within the world today, there are people that seem to treat it as if this is the right way to think. Discussion on that before we go to the next point?
One common objection in Christians' minds is, but isn't that what God did with us? We are valueless to God in most people's minds. And in a sense, that's right because of our sinfulness. But he sacrificed himself for the sake of redeeming us of no value. And so they think that's the ultimate example of morality or love, and therefore that's the model. And I think the slip there is that they are confused on two parts, but both parts, the confusion revolves around thinking that the point was that we were valueless. One mistake is that it's not entirely true that we are valueless to God. We are still created in his image, and he had a vested interest, a value, in redeeming that image, in redeeming his original creation, restoring it to what he intended it to be. And then spinning off of that is the value of glorifying himself in that act of restoration, demonstrating his power and his wisdom and the way that he was able to pull off what seems to be the impossible. There's two massive values involved that God was seeking in the salvation of sinners. It's not true that he was valuing the valueless because it's valueless. He was using the fact that we had very little value as an occasion to point to his great value.
That's well said. Greg, did you have anything you wanted to add there before I go to the next section?
The example of Mother Teresa, I don't know very much about the historical figure herself. And it seems like every time I learn about a historical figure that I learned about in school, everything that, I was taught always turns out to be wrong. So from what I understand of a Mother Teresa type figure, this would be somebody who is going to places where human beings are suffering. And they're suffering from disease, they're suffering from poverty, and they're loving this human being because this is a human being who does have value. They're not going out in the middle of the woods and devoting their life to serving rocks. They're serving human beings who are created, as Jacob said, created in the image of God, who have value. There was a thought that I had last week after we were done with our video project. I looked back on it and I thought about God being possibly like an artist who is loving scrap metal. You know, an artist looks at a piece of scrap metal and doesn't love it for the sake of what it is. The artist loves the scrap metal for the sake of what it can be changed into. And I don't know if this would be a proper comparison to how God loves us. It's something that sounds nice. I'm not sure how it would compare to Scripture, so I would definitely love to hear thoughts on that.
Well, we already know in Scripture that God compares us to pots, so I suppose that there's no problem with comparing us to material objects as long as we understand that it's an analogy and that we are in God's image, and a pot clearly is not. Well, let's go to the next section in the book here. As we've just been discussing, there are implications on what Galt is saying about value and love for how we understand God's love for us. And there are previous videos that we've done at christianintellectual.com about God's love and about God's hate. And so you could review this one, Does God Hate Sinners? What is the Christian answer to that question? If you look at that, you'll see that there are reasons for God's love and there are reasons for God's hate, and also that hate and love are not always opposites, because there is a form of love which can exist at the same time as a different form of hate. As long as you understand that there's more than one sense of love. God shows kindness to all people, and that is love. He shows kindness in the form of rain and in the form of blessing people with crops. But that doesn't negate the idea that he also has wrath toward those same people. And perhaps he abhors them or hates them in some cases. So I just point that out because this overall approach that Galt has, where love and value are connected, does correspond to my understanding of Scripture and about God's love. And I don't think that Galt is wrong in what he's saying here, that there is this moral code out there that supposes that you ought to love depravity, that the greater the depravity, the greater your love should be for it. Now, there's a reason why this idea has entered into the imagination of Christian and Western civilization. Because we know that the love of our Lord Jesus and his passion for us and his sacrifice for us changes us and redeems us. So we have the seed of an idea that that kind of turnaround is possible. And that seed has entered Western literature. In the case of Jean Valjean in Les Mis, how the priest allows him to not have to face the consequences of something that he did, how that changes his heart, and then he becomes a redeemed man and a hero. We have this idea within civilization, and there is a good part to the idea. So ask yourself, what is it that John Galt is saying we must not do? Is it that we must not show kindness for the sake of bringing others to redemption? I don't think so. I don't think that's the issue. He's talking about whether or not we should value something, and why. That's the issue that he's discussing. Now, he parodies the view of his opponents. He says that to love those who are worthy of love is self-interest. Just self-interest, as if that were a bad thing. To love the unworthy, that's sacrifice, as if that were a good thing. Again, he parodies them. He says, you owe your love to those who don't deserve it, and the less they deserve it, the more love you owe them. This would be the tyranny of need. Well, what does that do to a person? He says that it brings your soul to the state of a dump heap that welcomes anything on equal terms, so that you would cease to value moral values. And then you will have achieved the state of moral perfection. And I think that that's consistent with Kant's outlook. He says that that would mean refashioning the life of your body in the spirit of a human stockyard, and the life of your spirit in the image of a dump. And he says such was your goal. You've reached it. Do you now moan complaints about man's impotence and the futility of human aspirations because you are unable to prosper by seeking destruction? This is the logic of what you guys are doing, he seems to be saying. He says that the degree of your ability to live was the degree to which you broke your moral code. Because sacrifice is morality on these understandings. So if you are not sacrificing, if you are building up your life, then you're not being moral. This introduces a contradiction into the moral code. To even live is immoral on this moral code. To the extent that you are living, you are not being moral. To the extent that you're being moral, you are not living. This is a problem. He goes on, he says, the mystics of both schools who preach the creed of sacrifice are germs that attack you through a single sore, the fear of relying on your mind. Remember I had said that the idea was that we assess something's value. There's a connection to the mind there. They tell you that they possess a means of knowledge higher than the mind, a mode of consciousness superior to reason, like a special pole with some bureaucrat of the universe who gives them secret tips withheld from others. He says they offer you as proof of their superior knowledge the fact that they assert the opposite of everything you know, and as proof of their superior ability to deal with existence the fact that they lead you to misery, and so on. And I can see why this would work, persuasively, rhetorically. I can see why this works within the church. When somebody says, well, the secret is the opposite of what you thought, that positions them as being somebody with superior knowledge. But what if there is no secret? What if what you thought at the beginning was right, and what they're saying is just made up? Middle of 149, Galt is going to mention the religionists and the communists, though not by name. He says the mystics of spirit, that would be the religionists, curse matter. The mystics of muscle, that'd be the communists, curse profit. The first wish men to profit by renouncing the earth, the second wish men to inherit the earth by renouncing all profit. That's almost like a tongue twister right there. But you get the idea. And when he is condemning these religionists, I agree with his assessment of them, though with slightly different shades. If an honest person asks them how are we going to achieve your ends here, they would say, how is the concept of the vulgar realists? The way that they might respond is to say, how is the concept of the vulgar realists? The concept of superior spirits is somehow. Rewards are achieved by wishing, is the implication here. And he says this is the whole of their shabby secret. The purpose for which they dissolve the absolutes of reason, logic, matter, existence, reality, is to erect upon that a plastic fog, a simple, holy absolute, their wish. That is the motive behind this whole system, this whole code of sacrifice. Top of 150, he says that the restriction they seek to escape is the law of identity. And now we've returned to this theme of metaphysics. It's the law of identity that they hate. How many times in this speech do we hear about the law of identity? It is what it is. And that's what they hate. The freedom they seek is freedom from the fact that an A will remain an A. He says, those who tell you that man is unable to perceive a reality undistorted by his senses mean that they are unwilling to perceive a reality undistorted by their feelings. It's their hatred of A is A, their feeling of rejection of that is motivating them. And he says there is no honest revolt against reason. The motive is always to get away with something. That's the motive. Now he says the freedom you seek is freedom from the fact that if you stole your wealth, then you are a scoundrel. In other words, you are something. If you do something, that shows that you are something. That's the law of identity. If you skip a bit, he says you're seeking freedom from the idea that you are a man, that you are an entity, that you are. You're seeking freedom from the law of identity itself. He says no matter how eagerly you claim that the goal of your mystic wishing is a higher mode of life, the rebellion against identity is the wish for non-existence. The desire not to be anything is the desire not to be. And so this is how he demonstrates that this moral code of self-sacrifice is the moral code of death. That is the value in this moral code. That is the goal. This is where it takes you. They make their emotions their tool for perceiving reality. They hold their desires as an irreducible primary, a fact superseding all facts. An honest man does not desire until he has identified the object of his desire. He says it is, therefore I want it. They say, I want it, therefore it is. Again, they elevate the I wish above the it is. They want to cheat the axiom of existence. They want their consciousness to be an instrument, not of perceiving, but of creating existence. Any thoughts before we move to the next section? Go ahead, Greg.
I mean, when we talk about this mystical wishing thing, I've said before we have too many activists in the world and not enough scientists and engineers. I know AOC is an easy target, but you have people like AOC getting on TV complaining about climate change this, and environmental problems that, and it's like, well, just going on TV and saying that you care about these issues doesn't actually do anything to solve them. You know, if you want to solve problems like that, then work on creating new technologies so that people can, operate and can live and can, function without having to, rely on, an energy form that you particularly disagree with. And, with the escaping of the law of identity, it seems like that's what we see in a lot of places these days. You see that with the trans movement, you see that with leftism in general, but I'm sure we also see that, in conservative circles to an extent. I mean, I don't see very many conservatives run around saying I identify as a frog, but we have some of these problems on the right as well.
All right, let's go to the middle of 151. He says that whenever you committed the evil of refusing to think and to see, exempting from the absolute of reality some one small wish of yours, whenever you chose to say, let me withdraw from the judgment of reason, the cookies I stole, and then he has a comment about God there that I disagree with, let me have my one irrational whim, and I will be a man of reason about all else. That was the act of subverting your consciousness, the act of corrupting your mind. Your mind then became a fixed jury who takes orders from a secret underworld. And that is a real problem. Go ahead, Jacob.
You're skipping over the comment about the existence of God. I like to include that and turn it on them, on the objectivists. They're saying, let me exempt from rationality the cookies I stole, or the existence of God. What they mean is Christians indulging in belief about the existence of God, which is irrational and which they know to be irrational. I would flip it around and refer to their atheism on the topic of the existence of God, their irrational denial of the existence of God, which they, if they were being responsible, would know was irrational in the same manner as, stealing the cookies from the cookie jar or whatever.
They are the ones that are stealing the cookies. Bottom of page 151, he describes these links that we are trying to drown in our own mind, these causal connections. He says, the enemy that you're seeking to defeat is the law of causality, because it permits you no miracles. Now, as a Christian, I believe in miracles, but we are talking about the miracles of wishing so that it becomes so. And I agree with Galt that that would be a problem. The law of causality is the law of identity applied to action. So now we're talking again about some metaphysical things. You're familiar with these from our objectivism book study. All actions are caused by entities. The nature of an action is caused and determined by the nature of the entities that act. A thing cannot act in contradiction to its nature. These are metaphysical concepts, and they are at the base of all of our understanding of the world, and especially of philosophy. He says that the law of identity does not permit you to have your cake and eat it too. The law of causality does not permit you to eat your cake before you have it. So there's time, space, motion. You apply identity to the idea of time, space, and motion, and then you realize that there are certain things that happen in sequence. All right, where's he going with all this? Why is he even bringing up metaphysics here? Well, it's because he's pointing out that the opponents, his opponents, reject these metaphysical ideas. Here's what they do. He says, you can try to proclaim your right to eat your cake today and mine tomorrow. You can preach that the way to have a cake is to eat it first before you bake it, which is what Keynes, a famous economist, said. That the way to produce is to start by consuming. Again, that's Keynes. All wishers have an equal claim to all things. Again, that's Keynes. Well, what does that mean? He says that you're positing a world that has wealth being causeless. Why would you do that? The reason is because you want the unearned. And if you can show that it's uncaused, then you can argue that it's also unearned. And that's the motive, the shabby secret behind all of this, is that you want to be a leech. So the opponents here are denying causality. That's how he characterizes them. In fact, they don't just deny it, they reverse it. He says, you want unearned love, as if love the effect could give you personal value the cause. Unearned admiration, you want unearned wealth, unearned forgiveness, and so on. And he has an explanation there. It's worth thinking through. But then he says, who's going to pay for all this? And the answer is us, the thinkers. So the thinkers, the men of the mind, are the people who actually follow the process of thinking, which is the process of defining identity, discovering causal connections. So you have to be one or the other. You have to be a person who operates according to this proper metaphysics, or either you will or you won't. So now in the middle of 153, he says that for centuries the mystics of spirit had existed by running a protection racket. Essentially they were declaring production and joy to be sins, and then collecting blackmail from those who sinned. You see how twisted this is? You're telling people that the good things are bad in order that you can steal the good things from them. How would you justify yourself? There's no way to justify that. If they're bad, they're bad. Because they don't really believe it. They're not being consistent with their own claims. Bottom of that page. Now we are chained and commanded to produce by savages. And he says they're savages that don't even recognize who it is that's producing. They won't even acknowledge the existence of the men of the mind. Yet they seek to live as leeches off of them. Middle of 154, they seek not to build but to take over industrial plants. That's a reference to Karl Marx and to Lenin and Stalin. But just as they're doing that, they seek not to think but to take over human thinking. So this would be a reference to the professors that justify these things. We know that we are nothing, blanking out the fact that they are claiming knowledge. There are no absolutes, blanking out the fact that they are uttering an absolute. You cannot prove that you exist or that you're conscious, blanking out of the fact that proof presupposes existence, consciousness, and a complex chain of knowledge. The existence of something to know and a consciousness able to know it, and of a knowledge that has learned to distinguish between such concepts as the proved and the unproved. So these are people that are not just taking over factories, they're taking over the whole apparatus of philosophy itself, and they're destroying it by doing so. When a savage who has not learned to speak declares that existence must be proved, he's asking you to prove it by means of non-existence. This reminds me a lot of the presuppositionalists. Next paragraph. When he declares that an axiom is a matter of arbitrary choice, and he doesn't choose to accept the axiom that he exists, he blanks out of the fact that he has accepted it by uttering that sentence. The only way to reject it is to shut one's mouth, expound no theories. We'll skip through a little bit of this material. He's talking about the axioms. You're familiar with this from the Objectivism book study, so we don't need to go into it, but it's key material philosophically, but I'm going to take it for granted. Now go to 156. A savage is a being who has not grasped that A is A, that reality is real. And he goes into this description here of what that would be like. I'll skim through it. The evidence that they give him is an absolute, but his mind must learn to understand it. His mind must discover the nature of the things that he sees. And if you are not yet a human being in your mind, if you're not yet fully developed as a human being in your mind, you will not accept the responsibility to identify that things really are real. He says, to the savage, the world is a place of unintelligible miracles, where anything is possible to inanimate matter and nothing is possible to him. Middle of 157, his is the intellectual state of your modern teachers, and his is the world to which they want to bring you. So this is the problem of today's professors. If you wonder by what means they propose to do it, walk into any college classroom, and you will hear your professors teaching your children that man can be certain of nothing, that his consciousness has no validity whatsoever, that he can learn no facts and no laws of existence, that he is incapable of knowing an objective reality. So that's the problem. That's the problem that I see today in academia. That's the problem that is seeping into the church. He's right. I agree with everything he's saying here. Any interactions with that?
Basically what I see here with this, like, how do you know that 2 plus 2 equals 4, I have started labeling that in my mind pseudo-philosophy. Because as, you guys have pointed out many times here for the New Christian Intellectual, man can have knowledge. Somebody might come along and say you can't have really, really real knowledge, but the fact of the matter is you can have knowledge. You can know that 2 plus 2 equals 4. And I think that a lot of this postmodernism has shined philosophy into a bad light, where instead of being a respectable field where you're understanding logic, you're understanding epistemology, you're understanding how the world works and figuring out how do you know that you know. Western philosophy has been built on this amazing train of thought, and then all of a sudden you have people coming along and just brushing it away. And it's not philosophy, and I think it's really sad that it's taken this field of incredible value and just shined it into a bad light.
Well said. Thank you for that. Anything you want to add, Jacob?
We tend to think of the leftists as the crazy ones when it comes to postmodernism. I just want to point out that many, many, many conservatives, especially the influential ideologues or academics on the conservative side, agree with all the fundamental postmodern premises regarding our ability to know reality objectively, or rather our inability to know reality objectively. They're just better con men in that they don't blatantly carry that out to the logical, insane conclusions that the left does, that they're better at hiding it and smuggling it and making it seem respectable, partially because instead of defaulting to the novel, they default to tradition. But both are arbitrary defaults because of a lack of a means of objectively identifying the truth. Because they both accept the postmodernism of we can't know what's true. You have to rely on a default. The leftists rely on novelty as the default. Many conservatives rely on tradition as the default. But they're both fundamentally postmodern and ultimately dangerous.
The very next sentence, I have a comment in my margin, Yoram Hazony. That's my comment. Because this is what he says. What then is his standard of knowledge and truth? Whatever others believe. Now, you see this in both the left and the right, but it just depends on whether you want the general consensus of the others that are more wanting to create novelties, as Jacob's saying, versus the consensus of the others who are more wanting to maintain traditions. And within Yoram Hazony's work, Conservatism, a Rediscovery, we see explicitly him not being able to ground knowledge. He tries to ground it, and he grounds it in feelings. And we can show quotes on that. We have mapped it out. This is what he is saying, is that your epistemology ultimately must be grounded in feelings. He doesn't reject the idea that there are objective truths, but he redefines the idea of objective truths such that we don't have access to them. They exist outside of us. They're a faith commitment, or they're a feeling commitment. And that's how we somehow come into contact with them, but we cannot discern that they are objectively true. And it's on that basis that he's going to argue for his statist, collectivist, traditionalist approach to political theory. John Galt goes on at the bottom, reality is whatever people choose to say it is. There are no objective facts. Or perhaps, from the conservative point of view, there are objective facts, but we can't have access to them by an objective method. There are only people's arbitrary wishes, or in the conservatives' case, there are traditions. We cannot demonstrate why they are good, but we know that they're good because they're here. If a man seeks knowledge in a laboratory by means of test tubes and logic, that would be an old-fashioned, superstitious fool. A true scientist is a man who goes around taking public opinion polls. And we do see that today. That is sort of the approach of the con men, is to show that other people believe something, rather than to show that it's true. In the middle of 158, if you surrender your power to perceive, if you accept the switch of your standard from the objective to the collective, and wait for mankind to tell you what to think, you will find another switch taking place before your eyes you have renounced. You will find that your teachers become the rulers of the collective. And this is one of the motives. This is why the teachers are saying these things, because they will make themselves the arbiter of what the collective believes. They will elevate themselves, as philosophers all the way back to Plato have said, the world would be a better place if the philosophers were in charge. And that's us. Observe with what passionate consistency the mystics of muscle are striving to make you forget that a concept such as mind has ever existed. Your consciousness, they tell you, consists of reflexes, reactions, experiences, urges, drives. Words have the power to condition you, he says. And then they go on and they say that a factory is a natural resource. Human labor is a natural resource. These things are like trees, rocks, mud puddles. There's no significant difference. They've taken the mind out. It's no longer part of their understanding or concept. The problem of production, they tell you, has been solved and deserves no study or concern. The only problem left for your reflexes to solve is now the problem of distribution. And then he gets into this discussion where he mentions something very much like what we hear in politics today. Today there's a discussion of a concept called the universal basic income. It's the idea that everybody is granted basic levels of subsistence by their betters. That's what it means. He says they proclaim that every man born is entitled to exist without labor, and the law of reality, to the contrary notwithstanding, is entitled to receive his, quote, minimum sustenance, his food, clothes, and shelter, with no effort on his part, as his due and birthright. To receive from who? Blank out. This is exactly what the universal basic income would do. It would say that any person in the country is entitled to sit all day and do nothing. Play video games, read books, watch TV, and then they are entitled to receive $20,000 a year, or whatever the number is in a given year. That's the theory. At the bottom of this page, he says, the backward peoples of the world demand a higher standard of living. Demand? By whom? Again, blank out. So then it turns into not only everybody in our country, but everybody in every country. is owed subsistence by those who are able to provide it. How do they become able to provide it? What do they have to do to be able to provide it? Not my problem. Bottom of the page. Did you wonder what is wrong with the world? You are now seeing the climax of the creed of the uncaused and the unearned. Once again, he is proclaiming what justice is, and he's proclaiming what the injustice is in the world today. There's a passage about this in Proverbs 30:15. It says, "The leech has two daughters. Give and give." And I try to quote that whenever I see people calling for race-based reparations today, or whenever I see people calling for socialism or social justice. Give and give. The leech has two daughters. So we can know what you are by what you're saying. You're a leech, not a religious leader. You're a leech, not a political leader, not a thought leader. Make no mistake about the character of mystics. To undercut your consciousness has always been the only purpose throughout the ages, and power, the power to rule you by force, has always been their only lust. Bottom of 160. But it cannot be done without your consent. If you permit it to be done, you deserve it. Now he says, what happens to people to make them willing to accept this? To be willing to accept this, you have to invalidate your own mind by an act of your own choice or default. And so let's get into this. Sort of taking the scalpel and doing an autopsy. What happened here? A mystic is a man who surrenders his mind at his first encounter with the minds of others. At the top of 161, faith in the supernatural begins as faith in the superiority of others. Now, I, again, don't agree with his perspective on what the word supernatural means, but he does rightly criticize something here, doesn't he? So he will try to hide his lack of understanding when he sees that other people seem to have assumed something is true, but he doesn't understand it. He doesn't do the work to figure it out, and so he just assumes they must be right, and I would rather look right to the collective than be right. I'd rather appear to have it together than actually do the work to get it together, because doing the work would require embarrassing myself. He thinks to himself that others possess some mysterious knowledge. And so he becomes driven in the middle of this page by this urge to impress, cheat, flatter, deceive. He wants to force that omnipotent consciousness of others to conform to making him look good. They are his only key to reality at this point. And he makes a helpful comparison here. He says, they are his only means of perception, and like a blind man who depends on the sight of a dog, he feels he must leash them in order to live. To control the consciousness of others becomes his only passion. Have you ever felt in a social situation, perhaps when you were on the playground in school, that if only you could change the way other people perceived you, that would change your life? See, that's when you're falling into this mistake and this vice of treating other people's consciousness as if it is the most important thing. And I think everybody's experienced this to some degree, this feeling of being rejected by others at some point. And this question, okay, so do I still have value, even though I've been rejected in their eyes? What's going to have primacy here? My apprehension of the reality of my own value, or their apprehension of the reality of my own value? You've got to make a choice there. Any interaction on that?
That little speech you just gave, definitely strikes home for me because, even though I'm somebody who, I will think independently. Like if I know that something's true, I'll stand on it. I'll say this is true. And, I've had a lot of, Christians give me a hard time because of this. It can be hard to, have other people reject you. And, that might be partly, how we're wired because, a man who's totally on his own, totally away from, the city or the tribe or, the other group of people, he's not necessarily in a good position. So, feeling alone, that's something that human beings have a natural aversion to. But at the same time, I think that it's important to be able to objectively say, hey, I have value. I have good qualities, I have strong qualities, and just because once in a while somebody else doesn't like me, that doesn't make them go away. That doesn't diminish that fact. And the reality is, sometimes other people aren't going to like you. I see some people will make excuses in life. They'll say, well, I can't get ahead because employers will, not like me because of my ethnicity or my gender or whatever it is. So I can't get ahead in life. But at the end of the day, it's like you're going to have other people not like you. not everybody in life is going to like you. And if everybody in life did like you, that would probably be a bad thing, because even Jesus had people who didn't like him. And you can say the same thing about the prophets and the apostles. It is important to remember the truth for anybody out there who might be struggling with the same thing.
Thank you for sharing that, Greg. If we take seriously what Galt is saying here about valuing yourself and not elevating other people's opinions of you as that was the most important thing, then that gives us a tool that we can use in this world, especially to help confront some of the challenges in the world today. There are a lot of young white men out there who think that the world hates them because the world seems to be saying that it hates them because they're white, although I don't know that the world all takes that as seriously as they would propose. But then at the same time, there are woke men, Kyle J. Howard, and that are in this mindset, Ali Hinney, and a whole bunch of these other people that we've discussed in the past, that seem to think that we have to argue to decolonize our minds of whiteness and things like this. The problem that they all have in common is that they have elevated the impressions of others of their own value. And now they've been stung by it, and so now they're saying there's an injustice here. They have rightly identified the fact that there is an injustice of some kind, sometimes, but perhaps they've misdiagnosed the reason for it. So, for example, let's say somebody said to me that they didn't like me, and I got the impression that it was because I was white. Or let's say somebody said to Kyle James Howard that they didn't like him, but he got the impression that it was because he was black or something like that. What if I'm just not pleasant? What if Kyle James Howard is just not pleasant to somebody for some reason? We mistake the cause and effect here. It creates a victim mentality. And what John Galt is saying here is going to free us, whether it be Cody Leibold, who's not popular with the woke people, or Kyle James Howard, who's not popular with the based people. If you take what he's saying here, this is the answer. And I'm saying this to you, Kyle, if you ever watch this. I mean, we went to the same seminary. In some senses, we're mirror images of each other. We both need to take this seriously. The answer for both of us is in here. This is the answer for how we can overcome things like feeling rejected by other people. You have the answer here. It's to stop letting other people's consciousness dictate your sense of value. And then after that, there will be other logical things you have to work through.
When I was, talking just now, I was thinking of young black men who they might go apply for a job and potentially get turned down, because they're black. Now, whether that's perception, thinking, well, would this person have gotten turned down anyway, even if they were white, or whether they actually did get racially discriminated against. If you get discriminated against by one company, go across the street to their competitor, because there are opportunities out there in America. And at the end of the day, if you look at history, there have been racist people who would hire blacks and pay them. As Thomas Sowell put it, even though they might have preferred people who looked like them, they preferred themselves to everybody else. So if you could go there and you could do the job and you could get the job done well, you could get hired even by somebody who's racist. So the bottom line with that is there's opportunity out there. If you live in America, you have opportunity. You can go get ahead. You can make something of your life. And just because one employer doesn't like you, you go on to another.
I'm going to argue that this problem that we see in society today with people feeling like they have to push some kind of diversity and inclusivity agenda on other people, that problem relates to this idea of power lust to control other people's minds that John Galt describes here. He says power lust is a weed that grows only in the vacant lots of an abandoned mind. Now, there are legitimate temptations to want to control how other people perceive you, because being perceived well by your peers and your society is not a bad thing. But this is one way that you can understand what's going on in our society today. Ask yourself, are they not trying to control how other people perceive other people? When you see a TV commercial where there's absolutely never a smart white man presented in any commercial, it's always the man is dumb, the woman is smart, or it's always the colored woman is smart, but the white woman is dumb. You get this over and over again. And the problem that we see here is that they are trying to change the perception of other people. They're trying to control how other people see other people, because they want to control your mind, because they think that if they could change your mind, then they would change reality. So this is a way of understanding what is motivating the woke movement. And It's not all wicked motivation, but it is a wicked approach to solving the problem. I think that the approach is not reality-oriented. The approach is not truth-oriented. The approach is, let's just present reality as different than it is, so that we can try to correct something. Well, they're getting more forceful about how they do it, and they're dictators. This is entering into our public education. This is entering into our laws and the hiring practices of the government, and who gets funded by the government, and who gets contracts. Well, of course it does. Every dictator is a mystic, and every mystic is a potential dictator. And so these people that have become mystics, they have become collectivist, other-oriented thinkers, become dictators by the logic of their position. Middle of 162. He says, whoever rejects reality rejects existence, and the feelings that move him from then on are hatred for all the values of man's life and lust for all the evils that destroy it. The ideal of this system is death. That's where this is leading. He says that destruction is the only end that the mystic's creed has ever achieved, as it is the only end that you see them achieving today. And if the ravages wrought by their acts have not made them question their doctrines, if they profess to be moved by love, yet are not deterred by piles of human corpses, it is because the truth about their souls is worse than the obscene excuse you have allowed them. The excuse that the end justifies the means, and that the horrors they practice are means to nobler ends. The truth is that those horrors are their ends. And you can see that in the psychology of some of these woke people. They clearly hate their opponents, not just wishing to change their opponents, but wishing to see them punished. 163. He seeks obedience for the sake of obedience and destruction for the sake of destruction. That is what we are going to see in the world in ever-increasing quantities unless we combat this trend. Notice that the Democrats have this as their worldview. Destruction for the sake of destruction. This is the meaning of their policies, and therefore I argue the need for polemics. I argue that we must speak out, that we must chastise these people, separate from them, tell them that they're wrong, shun them. I argue these things on the basis of what it is that they're teaching. If they would position themselves as our enemies, then we must become polemical and say, you have become my enemy and this is what that means. And then we must encourage them. This is the line. You do not cross this line. If you do cross this line, you will not be my friend anymore. I will still care for you. If you ask me for a gallon of milk, I'll give you a gallon of milk because you're my neighbor. But I'm not going to invite you to be my friend. You will not be coming over for my parties. I will not pretend that you are anything other than my enemy. And this is going to continue for as long as you keep voting for Democrats and saying that these things are good. It's going to continue because we have to draw the line somewhere. We have to teach people that this is the meaning of the action that they're taking. We have to warn those people who are close to that boundary. Don't cross it. Because you cross that boundary, you cross me. So that's what is going on. Let's look again in what Galt says. There is no way to buy him off. The bribe he wants is your life. We cannot buy off the Democrats. The bribe that they want is your life. That's why we must draw this line. In the next section, here's a couple of brief things I want to point out. He says, you who are innocent enough to believe that the forces let loose in your world today are moved by greed for material plunder. Then skipping, he says, they do not want to own your fortune. They want you to lose it. Skipping again, it is not your wealth that they're after. Theirs is a conspiracy against the mind, which means against life and man. He points out it is a conspiracy without leader or direction. It's a conspiracy of the ideas themselves, the premises. So these random little thugs of the moment will come in and cash in on it at one time or another. That's not the main issue. The main issue is that the idea itself, this moral code of death, is pushing people in this direction. And so for that reason, he summarizes, death is the premise at the root of their theories, death is the goal of their actions and practice, and you are the last of their victims. And that's as far as the reading goes today. You have to take it seriously that this is the code of death. This is what they're doing. In the coming sessions, we're going to hear what John Galt has to say about what to do about all this. And he's going to advocate, in the context of the story, going on strike. And I'm going to say that we can do similar things in our life, although it's not a physical strike, it's not the same kind of format. What we are going to do is to go on strike morally. And we'll talk more about that as time goes on. I want to say thank you everybody for being on the recording today. And you can find replays at christianintellectual.com/intellectual. Our podcast is designed to fill the world with Christians who are skilled with moral reasoning. And we are plundering the Egyptians to figure out how to do this and how to bring a new renaissance so that we can revitalize Western civilization based on logic, based on sound philosophy, and of course based on sound theology and understanding of Christian religion. Thank you for joining us, and God bless.